This video will cover the SQL group by clause with a conceptual example, essentially outside of the AdventureWorks database. And so, in prior videos, we covered an introduction to the group by and aggregation functions that are applied to groups of values for particular fields. And then we also there's another video out there that covers the group by clause, essentially replicating a group by clause in SQL with the Excel pivot table. And so that, for those who are familiar with the Excel pivot table, that's a nice way to think about the way that the SQL group by clause works when you're essentially performing these aggregation functions, such as a sum or a count, across values of a different field. So essentially grouping, performing summary statistics with across values for a different variable. And so if we just jump into, so we covered all this portion of the PowerPoint in a prior video. So if we just jump into the examples that I've created here. We start first with just a single aggregation function, and then grouped across a single variable or a single other additional field. And so on the left-hand side, we just select star from table name, and so this is a fictitious data set. And with the select star, right, we're selecting all fields, all records for all fields. Because we're not limiting the number of records. So we can essentially infer that this table has 12 records, the 12 records that are shown here. And so we have different information. We have a vehicle make field, a vehicle model field, a loan amount field, and a loan term field. And so the data is kind of meant to represent car loans. You know, you go to a dealership, you purchase a car, and then you finance a portion of it, and then you ultimately, which is your loan amount, and then you ultimately repay that loan amount over a given number of months, which this data represents months. So just the 36-month term would be a repayment period of 3 years. 48-month term is 4 years. 60-month term is 5 years, and so on. In terms of the vehicle make, you can see that in vehicle make and model, we have vehicles such as the Toyota Prius, the Honda Civic, the Honda Accord. And so the vehicle make is kind of is a larger brand under which, that has these various models of cars. And so this is kind of the data set that we're working with. The query here is essentially selecting vehicle make. So this field here, right, in the select list, and then it's requesting an aggregation function, count star, which essentially will count all the fields for all the records. And it's not providing a count of the fields, but rather a count of the actual number of records. And so we're selecting those two items, and because we're requesting an aggregation function with a field that is not part of an aggregation function, right? The SQL will require us to use a group by clause. If that's not ultimately what you want to request, then that means that the way that the select list is written is incorrect, because in this particular example, SQL is always going to require you to have a group by clause. And so what is the query going to ultimately do? It's going to count the number of records for each value of vehicle make. And that's essentially that last part for each vehicle make is shown here by the group by clause. And just to walk through a couple other features of the query, the fictitious query, we have an alias of make for vehicle make, and then we also have an alias of record count, or record underscore CT, shorthand for record count. And so those two fields, right, your vehicle make and your count star with aliases make and record count, the aliases ultimately are what's displayed in the output. So just to walk through the results of the query, we're counting the number of records for each value of vehicle make. So we'll just take the first one. This output is ordered by vehicle make as well. So the make is going to appear in alphabetical order. as you can see here. And then just talking through this, a forward make or forward value for make. If we go over to the original table, we're going to see there's one value here, the second record, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there are ultimately 5 records with a value of forward for vehicle make, and that is what is displayed in the first record of this query, which aggregates performs an aggregation function, specifically counting, and then across grouping by the field vehicle make. And so you can ultimately find that there are 4 values of Honda in the table, and then there are also 3 values of Toyota for vehicle make. And so once we perform this query, the number of records that are displayed in the counting in the count field should ultimately equal the number of records that were in the original table, which is 12. And that's because we don't have a where clause. If we restricted it, then we would potentially have fewer records. All that said, another important thing to recognize with a grouping clause in SQL is that ultimately whatever field, or we'll just talk about one field for now, whatever field you're aggregating across, it's going to display the unique values for that particular field. And so that is going to determine the number of records in your output. So without a where clause, again, we go over to the vehicle make field and we see that there are 3 distinct values for vehicle make. There's Toyota, Ford, and Honda, and there's no other values in this particular field. And because there are 3 unique values, that means our output will ultimately have 3 unique, 3 records, each record reflecting the unique value for the make. Last point here, you can't use aliases in the group by. This means group by vehicle make, as it's shown, uses the field from the table source. You could not exchange the make alias here for the vehicle make field from the table source. SQL will return an error because it ultimately doesn't find a field called make in the original table. It sort of looks for this field make as part of the group by clause over here in the original table. You can see that there is no field named make, and so SQL will return an error in that case. Moving on to the next example, same aggregation. Same aggregation, count star. So counting the number of records, but ultimately we are grouping across two fields, which both appear in our select list. So we're going to group our counts, by these 2 fields. So what that means is the number of records displayed in our final output will be the number of unique combinations of values for the vehicle make field and the vehicle model field. So you can see we have Toyota Prius. That's 1 unique value, which would ultimately collapse records 1, 6, and 7 because those all have the same make and model. And so that's kind of there are ultimately 7 unique make and models in this table, in the original table. And so that ultimately determines the number of records in your output with a group by clause. And then also each one of those unique values is going to have some sort of summary statistic or an aggregation. Ultimately, it's an aggregation function, the result of which will be displayed in another field. So in this particular example, we're counting the number of records for each unique value of make and model. We can see, for example, we did the Toyota Prius example, and we can see that there are 3 records that ultimately have a value of Toyota for the make field or vehicle make field, and a value of Prius for the model field. And so this is kind of showing you that you can group by more than one variable, and ultimately what you're doing there is grouping by unique combinations across the grouping variables. Moving on to example 3, we're going to do multiple aggregations. We're going to come back to our original, our first query, which is just grouping by the make, because ultimately there's only 3 values. You can kind of see what SQL is doing behind the scenes a little bit better. So talking through the aggregation functions, we have our count of records, which is the same as what we had before. So these first 2 columns here are going to be the same as what we reviewed in the first example. Then we have a couple other aggregation functions. We're ultimately going to sum the values in the field loan amount, and then we're going to take an average of values in the loan term field. So what does this mean? Let's just start with Toyota, right? So we have, if we look at the records that represent Toyota 1, 6, and 7, we can see that the loan amount is about 13.4 thousand. Then we have, a 24 and 9. So let's just call that 25. These two together represent maybe 35. So 21.7 and 13.4 is about, what did I come up with? About 35,000, and then with your 25,000 on top of that, you ultimately get to something that is around 60,000, right? So you can see that ultimately what SQL is doing is taking this value for Toyota, this value, summing together to arrive at the summary statistic that's displayed for this record. And the same will be true for values of the make field for Ford and Honda. Talking through the term, it's going to take, for example, working with Toyota again, it's going to take the 36-month term here and then average it across 2 48-month terms. And so the average of those two, or those three values, is ultimately going to be 44. And so this is the example is really looking at different aggregation functions other than counting that you can perform with a SQL query. The last thing I think I want to call out here is really this question below, right? If we think about data type precedence, so essentially what kind of data type is returned from an operation, given the underlying data types that the operation is performed upon. So if loan term, so talking about this original field, is a data type integer, right? What is the data type for average terms? Essentially what's returned from the query. And so that data type is also going to be an integer value because the input data type is an integer, and the way that SQL works with data type precedent, the output is ultimately going to be an integer. So what does that mean? That means that you might not have the specificity here that you ultimately want, right? You might want a decimal precision for your average months term, because this is ultimately going to be truncated to the nearest ones place. And so not the nearest ones place, but it's ultimately any decimals are going to be truncated is what I was trying to say. So this ultimately shows you how a more complex, more aggregation functions in a query will work with a grouping criteria. And so that's the three examples that I have in this particular slide. So again, to cover what we reviewed, we did a single aggregation function account across a single select item or a single grouping criteria. We did a single aggregation, that same aggregation function counting across two values or two fields that we were grouping by. And again, what that means is when the more fields you add, you're ultimately grouping by unique combinations of values across those fields. And then going to the third example, which shows multiple aggregations across a grouping criteria.